Today we're focusing on the 5.56 side of the 223. Not going to talk too much about the 9mm today, but what we're going to be focusing on is how to deal with some of those special nuances with Milsurp brass or military surplus brass. But we've also been walking through very carefully a case preparation checklist. And on our last video, I should say, we ended up cleaning, using my ultrasonic cleaner, we cleaned the 5.56 brass. Understand that the 223 and the 5.56 cases are dimensionally exactly the same. The only difference in that cartridge, or those two cartridges, is the size of the chamber, the configuration of the chamber, which is, for the most part, very, very similar, exactly the same, except for the length of the throat in the chamber. Now, the throat, or that lead area, moving into the lead area, is longer in a 5.56 chambered rifle. So let's say we take a 5.56 ammo, take some 5.56 ammo, a round, we load it, insert it into a 223 chamber. It might chamber fine. If we're shooting a 77 grain long for caliber bullet, what we might get is that bullet in a 223 might jam up into the lands of that rifle, and it may not seat, number one. It also, if it fires in a 223, that bullet could be jammed in against the lands of the rifling, which is not how it's supposed to work. And then you're going to get excessive pressures. You can get excessive pressures that cause a lot of problems. So not necessarily is a 5.56 by 45 NATO loaded to higher pressures automatically. What it is that the size of that throat can cause pressures to be excessive in a 223 because that bullet is jamming up against the rifling. But I digress a little bit, but I did want to talk about that. But now let's go on to the next step of the military primer crimp removal process. Now, as I already noted, true mil-spec ammo, military ammo, will have a crimped primer. And there are various ways that different manufacturers will crimp the primer in place. I'm using Norma brass right here, and it has probably the most evident primer crimp that I've seen. And so it really works very well for this demonstration. You're going to see three prominent places where this primer is crimped in place. Now, it's not always going to be this obvious. So my recommendation and what I do is that for all of my 5.56, and we even actually see some crimped primers on 223 today, so all of this stuff that I'm loading, I'm going to run every one of them through stage number 1 on my case prep station. That is the crimp remover, primer crimp remover tool. And then secondly, I'm going to use the Dillon Super Swage machine or tool. Okay, I've got these 3 Norma cases. I have deprimed these, gone through all the steps up to using the case prep station. And as you can see, I've got those crimps I've got to remove. But we're going to run it all the way through the entire case prep station. I can feel it hitting here, and now primer pocket uniformer. Now I had to trim these cases, so I need to do a good job on the chamfer. I'm sorry, the chamfer here, deburr there. I normally do deburr, chamfer, back to deburr just a little bit, and then run that neck on the brush. And let's take a look at the final results. You can still see the marks where the crimp was applied to that primer, but it does not intrude into the primer pocket itself. Well, it doesn't look like it does. We're going to make sure it doesn't by using this super swage machine or tool in just a minute. Now this process is also very, very simple. Only takes a little bit of time. What we're going to do is we're going to place one case here on this ram, lower it, and I have it set so that once I lower it, it can only lower into a certain position, and that's going to be the perfect position for this 556, 223. And then I'm going to run this handle fully downward as far as it will go, bring it right back up, and that has completed a swage on this primer pocket. I should have clamped it down with a second clamp like I normally do. That one actually felt kind of loose, which is interesting. Well, there's another step now before we're completely done with that basic or bare essentials case preparation, and that is that we want to check the primer pockets. Now, we will do this for Milsurp brass, and we'll do this for any type of centerfire brass, centerfire rifle in particular. So, what you're going to need to do this is you're going to need some gauges. These are pin gauges. I purchased these through Granger. This is Vermont gauge, and they come in all different sorts of sizes. This is 0.1746, and this one goes with it. As far as I'm concerned, it is 0.1730. Very similar in size, different just a little bit. And we would use this 1730 gauge if we wanted to check if a primer pocket was too small. And that doesn't happen too often. The one I'm more interested in is this one here, 1746. This is for small primer pockets. Could be rifle or could be pistol. So this is the 5.56 and the 9mm. And this is this very nice, very precisely created stainless steel pin gauge. What I do is I am going to use this little thing. Now, I made this myself, painted it. John Deere green actually is the spray paint. Just took a bunch of very thin dowels, drilled a whole bunch of holes in this thing. Using my drill press. You can make this really, really easy. Now, the reason why I do this is a really nice way to dry our cases, dry my cases after they come out of that ultrasonic cleaner. I will actually pour that, I don't pour the liquid though. I take all that brass and I'll kind of pour them out onto a nice towel, dry them a little bit, and then pretty promptly they go here on this drying rack. Now, while they're on this drying rack, I can take the pin gauge because its primer's up at this point. They've been draining through. You could do this whenever you wanted. And we're going to check every one of these. And it goes really fast. I mean, it really goes fast. Now, this should not fit. This is a 1746, and it should not fit. If you get one that does seem to fit, don't fret right away. Don't throw it away, because sometimes there's almost like a chamfer on that primer pocket, and it will allow the pin to insert just a little bit. But you can insert it kind of get a little measure with your thumb, pull it out, and it's only inserting just that little bit. This primer pocket is good. It's not too large. Well, I'll continue that process, and normally I'll set this on a table and I can go through this. Occasionally, and not very often, but occasionally, I will get another case, or I'll get a case where this primer, where this pin just goes right in. Nothing to it. It just goes right in. That primer pocket is too big. That's a problem. You can insert a primer into that, seat that primer. You might be able to knock it out by hand. Or if you don't do that, you don't catch it, you'll fire it, it'll fly. It'll absolutely eject from that case. That is tired old brass. I have an entire video on that talking much more about that, but the gist is this. If you get a primer pocket that is too large, it failed the test, chuck it, throw it away. Now, I've had people tell me, oh, but you can fix that. There's lots of videos on how to fix that piece of brass so its primer pocket comes back into spec. Well, let me tell you, I don't care if you can supposedly fix that. There's more wrong with that piece of brass than just what you just caught. It is tired old brass. It has run its life. Brass will not last forever. That's one of the signs something's wrong. Get rid of it. Having yourself injured or, doing some damage to your firearm, whatever, is not worth a couple pennies, okay, that this brass may cost. So get rid of it. I don't care. This is for small primer pockets. I've also got a set of these gauges for large primer pockets. 2085 primer pocket is too small. 2101, if that fits into it, it's too big. Again, this is the important one, checking for too large of a primer pocket. Take good care of these things. Don't dent them up. They won't work anymore. And that takes care of that step. Now, when we're talking about Milsurp or military surplus brass, it could be your M193s, M855, all of that sort of stuff, or other military surplus brass of different calibers. What is very challenging, we could say, is the primer pockets. So we're going to focus some more on those primer pockets. And the real problem is that a lot of that, I'll dare say all military brass will have a crimped primer. That primer is seated into the primer pocket, and then for a number of reasons discussed and set up by military standards, that primer pocket is crimped to keep the primer in place. You've got to remove that before you try to insert a new fresh primer. You can pop it out really easily when you're resizing that brass and decapping that brass. It'll come out very easily, but you will not be able to insert a new fresh primer into it. You'll know the difference if you go heavy-handed on it, on that whatever unit you're using, a RAM priming press or whatever it is. You go heavy-handed on that, you're going to crush that primer and you may detonate the primer right then and there. Don't do that. Now we're just about done, and you'll notice, or if you've been watching all of these videos along the way, you'll notice that I've spent a lot of time talking about and dealing with, caring for primer pockets. Primer pockets are really important, as is the choice of a primer that we're going to talk about later on in this season of extreme reloading. Now, how can I tell a good primer pocket from a not so good primer pocket? Number one, using the pin gauges that we've just talked about and demonstrated, you're going to be able to identify bad primer pockets and discard those things. But what makes for a good or really good, extremely good primer pocket? A couple of things, and that is why, and we talked about this previously, we use the primer pocket uniforming tool as part of that RCBS case prep station. It happens to be station number 3. That tool, used correctly, will uniform, as the name implies, the primer pockets. It will cut out just a little bit, smooth out, clean out the walls of the primer pocket, and it'll also make sure, and this is the important part, it'll make sure that the primer pocket depth is correct and, more importantly, consistent. Consistency equals accuracy. If you've learned nothing else from watching this entire season of Extreme Reloading or any of our other videos, we got to know that. You got to know that. Consistency equals accuracy. And that's not my mantra. I do use that, but that is from Colonel Plaster in his sniper book and sniper training. Anyway, that is super important. Now, the only brass that I do not use the primer pocket uniforming tool on is alpha brass. Alpha brass has what they call a stepped primer pocket. They've specifically designed it to try to improve precision, improve the ignition, and so I don't use that tool on that particular brass. We'll talk more about that in the future, I'm sure, especially when we do talk about priming these cases. But for all other brass, including Lapua, I will use the primer pocket uniforming tool. So the depth of that primer pocket is really important. If we can perfect that, uniform that, make it extremely consistent, then we've got an extremely good primer pocket. Are we done with basic case prep? No. Not quite, but really, really close, and we're going to finish it. Here I have all of this brass that I've just run through the super swage. My last step is to case sort these things. And how do I do that? What's the best way to do it? Some folks will weigh the cases and sort them into batches based on the weight. That's good. There's nothing really wrong with that. And then others will fill the cases with water, some sort of liquid. That's difficult when you already have taken the primer out. But some folks will do this part of the process with the dead primer in place, and then they'll weigh and then they'll sort that brass prior to doing any of this other stuff. And that's okay. I don't think too much of that process, though, because it's really, really difficult to get what we call repeatable measures when you're trying to weigh the volumetric capacity of these cases. Just try that sometime. Take a spent case and weigh that case, its capacity in water, let's say. Weigh it, but do it 10 times for one piece of brass. I've done that, and it will vary. My measurement on the exact same piece of brass will vary by a couple tenths of a grain, sometimes several tenths of a grain. So that's kind of not so good, right? Because what are you sorting on, right? It's not my favorite method, and I no longer use it. I did it years ago, and then I found there was too much variability just in the measures, so I stopped doing that. For 5.56 and 223 brass, and my 9mm, I like to sort by head stamp. What I found is that is pretty much what you got to do, and it's going to get you so far in this entire process. Sort by head stamp. This one happens to be Federal Champion, FC. So I put this into a pile of my Federal brass. And then my second one, I'm going to do this. This happens to be, oh, that's also a Federal Champion. Well, I'm lucky. And I'll go through every one. I've got 34 pieces of brass now. Remember, we lost one earlier. We discarded one earlier, didn't make it through the process. I'll sort these by head stamp. And like I said, that does a great job for you. I like to use Lapua brass a lot. We're going to talk more about kind of the extreme side of reloading, premium brass in the future. And Lapua brass, Hornady over here in Remington, and some of the premiums, like I said, Lapua and Alpha and ADG. They tend to self-sort in weight anyway. I have not seen a lot of Lapua brass that varies by much more than a grain for 308 Winchester brass. So just sorting by the case weights, by the case head stamp is going to do a lot for you. It is an important step. It is an important step for 5.56 also, just because some cases, some brands of brass have much thicker brass, which means smaller case capacities. Others, much thinner brass, higher case capacities. And just assuming, hey, this is 223, I loaded it with my hot load with that sort of thing, and that was not a problem. Now I'm just going to grab this other handful of brass and load it up. You might have problems because that second handful of brass might be, or might contain some very thick brass, which is going to elevate your pressures. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that again, but just understand, this is an important little step. Easy to do. And again, you're going to be able to craft safe and reliable ammo. In our next video, we are going to walk through very quickly case prep one more time, but now I'm going to be imparting or adding some additional steps specifically for precision rifles. You don't want to miss that one, and thanks again for watching.